Good morning. Make sure I've got this thing down how it works. I'm Bob Topel, and I'm from the University of Chicago. I should probably tell you how I got involved in this. I'm on the National Petroleum Council's task force on the future of transportation fuels, along with Bill Reinert. And at our meeting in San Francisco, after a couple of days, with very short notice, one of the members of the panel asked me if I would give my comments on what had transpired during the meeting. And so I jotted down some quick notes, and I stood in the middle of a meeting like this and talked for about 20 minutes. And afterwards, Bill, who I hadn't met, decided to come up and give me his comments on my discussion. And he summarized it all in one sentence. He said, "You look just like Eric Clapton." So, you know, having heard this my whole life, I said, we were instant friends. And so later on, I sent him a paper that a couple of buddies and I had written, Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy, both of my colleagues at the University of Chicago. I sent it to Bill, and he said, "Oh, you got to come and talk about this at our sustainability conference." So here I am. So this paper is about the economics of climate policy. I wrote it as part of a project we have at the University of Chicago. It's called our Energy Initiative, and it was for a policy conference we ran in Washington, D.C. last year. So it's a great benefit to me to have written with Gary and Kevin, because they're one of the benefits of being at Chicago is I have really smart friends to work with. Now, the background here is that I think, as we all recognize here, is that energy is really essential to the maintenance of prosperity. So growth in human welfare, what do I mean by that? In economic well-being, means growth in energy use. Countries that use more energy are the ones that are richer, and as countries become rich, they're going to use more energy. So solving the energy problem, providing for abundant and cheap energy sources for societies that don't enjoy it now is probably one of the most, maybe the most important social problem of our time. Now, what we've come to realize over the last 20 years or so is that energy use now entails new evidence of social costs. So our current carbon-based fuels harm future generations. The basic fact is that we're now worse off than we thought we were going to be. And the U.S. then is committed, in some sense, to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, most of the proposed policies, like taxes or cap and trade, have a really firm economic basis. So keep in mind that I'm an economist, and I'm going to be talking about these things from an entirely economic perspective. So the goal of these policies is the efficient use of all resources, and I'll define efficiency shortly, including the efficient use of all scarce resources, including the atmosphere, which is a scarce resource, and that's going to be key. So the atmosphere is currently what we would call, as economists, unpriced, which means that we all act like it's free, and so it's overused in a competitive marketplace, or in any marketplace. The solution to that is to put a tax on emissions, what sometimes gets called, after a famous economist from the 1930s, a Pigouvian tax that brings the scarcity value of here, the atmosphere, to the attention of those who use it. And then let markets do their thing, work their magic for both the allocation of resources across people at a point in time and over time, and also to guide research incentives. And that sounds easy, but the key questions are, well, what's the price that you want to use? What's the tax? How do you price the atmosphere? And the design of that policy is a daunting informational problem, as I'll describe. The implementation of such a policy is worse than a daunting problem. So the challenges to policy implementation are the following, in my view. First, current generations get to decide. They have to be convinced, that is, our fellow citizens today have to be convinced there is a problem worthy of action and imposing higher costs. We're not there yet. And in a democracy, that's an even more formidable impediment. As H.L. Mencken, a famous journalist from the 20s and 30s, once remarked, Democracy is the idea that the people know what they want and they deserve to get it good and hard. So the second point is that current generations bear higher costs, but they get no direct benefit. So we've got to convince current generations to forego abundant energy sources in order to mitigate distant and uncertain harms. And as far as I know, such a sacrifice, such a trade-off over time, over such vast reaches of time, has never been done. The third challenge to policy implementation is that the atmosphere is what economists call a global public good. It requires, therefore, harmonized cooperation among nations over vast periods of time. That is, the atmosphere doesn't care at all, really, where another ton of carbon dumped into it comes from, whether it's being from India or Indianapolis. It all has the same impact on global environment. That means that divergent costs and benefits of policy challenge the form and the substance of agreement. And agreement among nations is key. So unilateral incentives challenge the effects of the agreement. Now, these challenges of policy design, when I talk about pricing carbon, it seems superficially simple. And if you listen to a lot of what goes on in policy circles, it sounds simple. You can use either a tax or a cap, which is the same as a quota, or in cap and trade. Now, the key issues that I want to talk about are, well, how do you value this climate capital? Because these policies are really investments in climate capital. How do you discount those distant costs and returns? How do you deal with uncertainty as to what those costs out in the future or benefits of current investments might be? How do you value catastrophic outcomes? This is something that people haven't done a lot of work on, but I think we have a few important things to say. What are the market responses to policy going to look like? How are these policies going to affect innovation incentives? And what are the costs of delay? So, for example, Kyoto didn't come off and Copenhagen didn't come off. And so we really don't have a global or harmonized policy in place as of today. And the prospects of getting one in short order are not very bright. So what are the costs of delay with regard to incentives? I'm going to show you that those costs are actually not very high. The characteristics of alternative technologies are going to matter for policy. And global harmonization of policy and design or implementation is a key issue, as I've already mentioned. So what we did in our work is first to define what's the efficient policy goal. And that efficient goal is to allocate the use of an exhaustible resource, here the atmosphere, over time. And that policy is going to determine the strength and timing of incentives. It's going to determine what I already mentioned, the cost of delay. And it's going to determine the impact of expectations on current carbon prices. So if we think that we're going to come up with something like Dyson's carbon-eating tree in 20 years, 50 years, 70 years, how does that affect the policy that we should be following today? And then the social valuation of these policies is also key. How do you value catastrophes? What's the implications for the distribution and the timing of harm? When I say distribution, I mean, is harm evenly spread across the population at some future date, or is it highly concentrated on some subset of the population? There are going to be important insurance properties of climate investments that is going to make, in our view, the value of climate investments much greater to developed countries like the United States and countries in Western Europe than they will be to developing countries like India and China. And those different valuations and discount rates for developing or developed countries are going to challenge any efforts at a harmonized policy. So what are these features of an efficient climate policy? First, I got to define efficiency in economics, because it's not the same sense of efficiency that the engineers and car guys have. For us, resources, things of value, should be put in an efficiency sense, should be put to the most valuable use. So in economics, efficiency is a benchmark against which we measure different outcomes. So the key point here then is that another unit of carbon-based energy is worth using if the benefits of using it today outweigh the costs. And those costs are going to occur mainly in the future. So both current and future benefits and costs matter. It's not zero emissions that we're looking for, it's efficient emissions. And that means we have to conceptualize the benefits and costs, including future costs of current use. Now, I teach this course at the University of Chicago, and sometimes I go teach high school students just for fun. I have a friend who teaches AP economics. In fact, his license plate is AP Econ. And he has this great phrase that he uses for his students in high school that I swiped from him. And he said, pigs are owned, whales are not. That's why whales are endangered and pigs are not. And the point there is that somebody has property rights in these pigs, and they see to it that the stock of pigs is used efficiently, whereas whales are all treated as if we all own them, like the atmosphere, and they're overused in a competitive marketplace, and so they're endangered. The atmosphere is that kind of global public good that no one owns. So it's overused in a classic example of what you all probably have heard of as the tragedy of the commons. The benefits of use for us occur today. In this case, the costs of current use occur way out in the distant future. So the policy question is, if units of atmosphere were owned, that is, if they were a privately owned resource like many others, and we had to pay to use them, what would be the price? And then the optimal economic policy for dealing with these issues is to price the atmosphere efficiently and let markets do their thing. So the conceptual framework is this. Think about the atmospheric concentration of CO2, of carbon dioxide, that we're willing to live with, like 550 parts per million. Now we're currently sneaking up, as I understand it, on 400 parts per million. So if we thought that the capacity, the remaining capacity we have is 550 minus 400, or 150 parts per million, that's an exhaustible resource. It's something that we can use up over time. We can use it today, we can use it next year, or we can use it in 20 years, but we've only got a finite amount of it. So it's just like oil or uranium or any other exhaustible resource, and you have to decide how fast you're going to use the resource over time. So we want to allocate the resource, the use of that resource over time, and we got to get a price that achieves that. So the key features of setting a carbon price are the following. First, the value of using an additional unit of atmosphere, that is, dumping another ton of CO2 into the atmosphere and using up some of that space, if you will, should be the same to all users at the margin. So the value to us today, or to me today, should be the value, same at the margin as the value to you today. And it should be the same in present value as the value to your grandchildren in a generation, or your great-grandchildren in 2 generations. So we have to allocate it over time, across individuals at a point in time, and across individuals over time. So the value of using an additional unit should reflect the full cost of using it. And that means a unit used now can't be used later. Just as a barrel of oil burned today can't be burned in the future, so owners of oil have to decide whether they want to sell it today or in the future. And in that world, if you think about this exhaustible resource as being like oil, then owners of oil have to be indifferent between selling it today and selling it in the future in order to be willing to hold the stuff for the future. And that's going to tell us something about how the price of an exhaustible resource, how the price of the atmosphere should change over time.